today's video, where I'm sharing the most jaw-dropping, heart-wrenching, and absolutely unbelievable Reddit stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. And if you enjoy this wild ride, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible content. Let me start with a story that honestly made me sit in silence for 10 minutes after reading it, and I think you'll understand why in just a moment, because what this person discovered about their entire life is something straight out of a psychological thriller. So this guy, let's call him Mark, posted on Reddit about how he found a box in his parents' attic while helping them prepare to move into a retirement community, and inside this box were letters, dozens and dozens of letters, all addressed to him from someone he'd never heard of. And the dates on these letters spanned from when he was born all the way up until he was about 15 years old. Mark was confused because the return address was from a town about 3 hours away, and he had no idea who this person could be. So he started reading the letters one by one, and what he discovered absolutely shattered his reality. The letters were from his biological father, a man he never knew existed, because his entire life he'd been told that his dad, the man who raised him, was his real father, and there had never been any indication otherwise. The letters detailed this man's desperate attempts to be part of Mark's life, how he'd send child support every month, how he'd beg Mark's mother to let him visit, how he'd send birthday presents and Christmas gifts that Mark never received, and how eventually his letters became filled with heartbreak and resignation as he realised he'd never get to know his son. Mark was 32 years old when he found these letters, and everything he thought he knew about his childhood was a lie, because his mother had kept this massive secret from him for over 3 decades, and the man he called Dad apparently knew about it and went along with it. He confronted his parent that same evening, and the story that unfolded was even more complicated than he could have imagined, because his mother had been in a relationship with his biological father when she got pregnant, but she'd been cheating on him with the man who became Mark's dad, and when she found out she was pregnant, she convinced her current boyfriend that the baby was his, even though she wasn't entirely sure. His biological father found out about the pregnancy and demanded a paternity test, which proved Mark was his son. But by that time, Mark's mother was already deeply involved with her new partner, and they'd built a life together, so she made the decision to cut the biological father out completely, claiming he was unstable and dangerous, which apparently wasn't true at all. The courts had granted the biological father visitation rights and mandated child support, but Mark's mother simply moved to a different state without telling him, changed her phone number, and created this entirely false narrative about their family. Mark's dad, the man who raised him, admitted that he knew Mark wasn't biologically his, but he loved him like his own son, and went along with the deception because he thought it was better for everyone involved, and he genuinely believed that Mark's biological father was a bad person based on what Mark's mother had told him. Mark was devastated, angry, confused, and felt like his entire identity had been stolen from him, because for 32 years he'd been living a lie, and worse, there was a man out there who desperately wanted to be his father, but was denied that chance because of his mother's selfishness. He immediately tried biological father, and what he discovered made the situation even more tragic because his biological father had passed away just 4 years earlier from cancer, and in his obituary it mentioned that he'd never married and had no children, which meant he died alone, never getting to know his son, never getting the chance to be a father, and that knowledge absolutely crushed Mark. He managed to track down some of his biological father's friends and extended family, and they all told him the same story, that his father had been a good man, kind and generous, who'd been heartbroken his entire life over losing his son, who'd kept every single photo he could find of Mark from Facebook and other social media, who'd followed Mark's life from a distance like a ghost, watching him grow up through screens and never being able to reach out because he didn't want to disrupt Mark's life. Mark learned that his biological father had been a high school teacher who was beloved by his students, that he volunteered at a local community centre teaching kids how to play guitar, that he'd set up a college fund for Mark that had been growing for years and was now worth over $100,000, money that was left to Mark in his will, along with a letter that Mark's biological father had written shortly before he died. The letter was the most heartbreaking thing Mark had ever read, because in it his father apologised for not fighting harder to be in his life, explained that he'd respected Mark's mother's wishes because he thought it was what was best for Mark, talked about how proud he was of the man Mark had become, even though they'd never met, and expressed his deepest hope that someday Mark would learn the truth and know that he was loved, truly loved, by a father who thought about him every single day. Mark's relationship with his mother completely disintegrated after this discovery, because when he confronted her with everything he'd learned, she tried to justify her actions by saying she'd done what she thought was best, that his biological father had been irresponsible and immature when they were young, and that she'd given Mark a stable home with a man who truly cared about him. But Mark couldn't see past the lies, the manipulation, the fact that she'd stolen his chance to know his real father and had robbed his biological father of the chance to be a dad. His relationship with the man who raised him became complicated too, because while Mark understood that his dad had loved him and raised him with good intentions, he'd still participated in the deception, still allowed Mark to believe a fundamental lie about his identity, and that betrayal cut deep. Mark ended up going to therapy to process everything, and through that process, he learned that his mother had shown signs of narcissistic personality disorder, that her need to control the narrative of their family was more important to her than anyone else's feelings or rights, and that she'd likely never take true responsibility for what she'd done. He also connected with his biological father's family, his paternal grandparents, who were in their 80s and overjoyed to finally meet their grandson, aunts and uncles and cousins who welcomed him with open arms, and through them he got to know the man his father had been, got to see photos and videos, got to hear stories about his personality and his quirks and his dreams. Mark used the money his biological father left him to create a scholarship fund in his father's name at the high school where he taught, a scholarship for students who'd overcome adversity and wanted to pursue education. and every year at the scholarship ceremony, Mark would tell the recipients about his father, about the man who'd loved him from afar, and in that way he kept his father's memory alive and honoured the sacrifice and pain his father had endured. The Reddit community was overwhelmingly supportive of Mark, with thousands of comments expressing sympathy and outrage at what his mother had done, and many people shared similar stories about discovering family secrets and having to reconstruct their identities. And that sense of community and shared experience helped Mark realise he wasn't alone in his pain. Years later, Mark posted an update saying that he'd gone through extensive therapy, had built strong relationships with his biological father's family, had maintained a distant but civil relationship with his mother primarily for the sake of his younger siblings, who were also his dad's biological children, and had come to terms with the complexity of his situation, understanding that his dad, who raised him, had genuinely loved him even if he'd made mistakes, and that his biological father's love had been constant and unwavering even across the distance and silence. Now let me move to another story that's completely different but equally compelling, and this one involves a wedding disaster that spiraled into something nobody could have predicted. This woman, we'll call her Jessica, posted about how she'd been planning her dream wedding for 2 years, had saved up over $40,000, had booked a beautiful venue, had invited 200 guests, and was just 3 weeks away from the big day when everything fell apart in the most spectacular way possible. Jessica had been with her fiancé, let's call him Ryan, for 6 years, and they'd been engaged for 2 of these years, and everyone thought they were the perfect couple, completely in love and ready to build a life together. Jessica's maid of honour was her best friend since childhood, a woman named Sarah, who'd been by her side through everything, breakups and job losses and family drama, and Jessica trusted Sarah completely, never had any reason to doubt their friendship. About a month before the wedding, Jessica noticed that Ryan had been acting strange, distant and distracted, spending a lot of time on his phone and being secretive about who he was texting. And when she asked him about it, he'd brush her off and say it was just work, stress, that planning a wedding was overwhelming and he needed some space to decompress. Jessica tried to be understanding, tried to give him the space he said he needed, but something felt off. Her intuition was screaming that something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. Then one day, about 3 weeks before the wedding, Jessica came home early from work because she wasn't feeling well, and when she walked into their apartment, she heard noises coming from their bedroom, and her heart immediately sank because she just knew what she was about to discover. She opened the bedroom door, and there they were, Ryan and Sarah, in bed together, and the look of shock and horror on their faces when they saw her would have been almost comical if it wasn't the most devastating moment of Jessica's entire life. Jessica didn't scream or cry or make a scene. She just stood there in complete silence, feeling like her entire world was collapsing around her. And then she turned around, walked out of the apartment, got in her car, and drove to her parents' house without saying a single word. Ryan and Sarah both tried to call her immediately, sent dozens of texts trying to explain and apologize. But Jessica blocked both of them and refused to engage because what was there to say? What possible explanation could make what they'd done acceptable or forgivable? The practical side of Jessica's brain kicked in pretty quickly, and she realized she had a massive problem because she had a wedding planned for 3 weeks away, deposits paid, guests invited, a dress that had been custom made, and now no groom and no maid of honor. She posted on Reddit asking for advice, asking if she should cancel everything and lose all the money she'd spent, or if there was some way to salvage the situation, and the responses she got were creative, supportive, and ultimately changed her entire perspective. Someone suggested that instead of cancelling the wedding, she should turn it into a massive party celebrating her freedom and her new beginning. Invite all the same guests, keep all the same arrangements, but instead of getting married, just throw the biggest celebration of her life with all the people who actually cared about her. Jessica loved this idea and she immediately started making calls, and surprisingly, the venue was willing to work with her. The caterer said they'd already prepared for the event, so they were fine with the change. The DJ thought it was hilarious and offered to create a special playlist for a freedom party. And most importantly, when Jessica called her guest to explain what had happened and invite them to come celebrate her anyway, almost everyone said yes. Her parents were incredibly supportive, told her they were proud of her for handling the situation with grace and strength, and her dad gave a toast at the party about how sometimes the trash takes itself out and we should celebrate when we dodge bullets. The party itself was apparently legendary, with Jessica wearing her wedding dress because she'd paid for it, and she looked amazing in it, with speeches from friends and family about her strength and resilience, with dancing and drinking and laughter. And Jessica said it was honestly one of the best nights of her life, better than her wedding would have been, because it was surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported her without any of the stress or expectation of a traditional wedding. But here's where the story takes another turn, because about 6 months after the party, Ryan reached out to Jessica through a mutual friend, asking if they could talk, and against her better judgment, Jessica agreed to meet him for coffee. Ryan looked terrible, like he'd aged 10 years in 6 months, and he immediately launched into this long explanation about how he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, how his relationship with Sarah had fallen apart almost immediately after Jessica found out, because it turned out their connection was based on deception and forbidden attraction rather than any real compatibility. How he'd been going to therapy and working on himself and realised that he'd sabotaged the best thing in his life because he was afraid of commitment and intimacy. Jessica listened to everything he had to say, and then she told him something that apparently made him break down crying. She said that finding him with Sarah was the best thing that could have happened to her, because it showed her who he really was before she'd legally tied herself to him, before they'd had kids together, before she'd wasted even more years on someone who didn't respect or value her. She told him that she'd done a lot of therapy too, and she'd realised that their relationship hadn't been as perfect as she'd thought, that there had been signs of his emotional immaturity, and his tendency to avoid difficult conversations, and that she'd been so focused on the idea of getting married and having the wedding she'd dreamed about that she'd ignored red flags that were waving right in front of her face. Ryan asked if there was any chance they could try again, if she could ever forgive him, and Jessica said no, absolutely not, because trust once broken that completely can never be fully repaired, and she deserved someone who would never make her doubt their loyalty or commitment. She also told him that she'd actually started dating someone new, a guy she'd met through a friend a few months after the party, and this new relationship was completely different, built on honesty and communication and mutual respect, and she'd never been happier. As for Sarah, Jessica never spoke to her again, blocked her on everything, and made it clear to their mutual friends that anyone who maintained a friendship with Sarah wouldn't be part of Jessica's life. And most people chose Jessica because they were horrified by what Sarah had done and couldn't respect someone who'd betray their best friend so completely. Jessica's final update on Reddit was about a year after the original incident, and she said she was engaged again, this time to the guy she'd started dating after the party, and she was planning a small, intimate wedding with just close family and a few friends, and she felt absolutely certain that this was the right person and the right relationship, because she'd learned so much about herself and what she needed and deserved in a partner. The Reddit community absolutely loved Jessica's story, loved how she'd turned a devastating situation into a celebration, loved her strength and her refusal to be a victim, and her posts got hundreds of awards and thousands of supportive comments from people who've been inspired by her resilience. Now let me tell you about a story that's darker and more disturbing, because sometimes Reddit reveals the truly troubling things that happen behind closed doors. This story comes from a guy we'll call Tom, and it's about how he discovered that his wife of 12 years had been living a double life that was so elaborate and so disturbing that it sounds like something from a crime documentary. Tom and his wife, let's call her Linda, had what he thought was a good marriage. They had 2 kids, a nice house in the suburbs, stable jobs, and from the outside, they looked like the picture-perfect American family. Linda was a stay-at-home mom who'd given up her career in marketing to focus on raising their children, and Tom worked long hours as an engineer to support the family financially. Tom travelled for work occasionally, usually just a few days at a time, and during those trips Linda would send him photos of the kids, updates about their day, and sweet messages about how much she missed him, so he never had any reason to suspect anything was wrong. Then, one day, Tom's company cancelled the business trip at the last minute, and instead of calling Linda to tell her he'd be home early, he decided to surprise her, thought it would be nice to come home unexpectedly and maybe take her out for a spontaneous date night while the kids were at school. When Tom arrived home in the middle of the afternoon, he noticed a strange car in the driveway, and his first thought was that maybe Linda had hired a contractor to do some work on the house. But when he walked inside, the house was quiet, too quiet, and he could hear voices coming from upstairs. Tom's heart started racing because he knew, somewhere deep in his gut, he knew what he was about to find. And when he walked upstairs and opened his bedroom door, there was Linda in bed with another man, and the look of pure terror on her face told Tom that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. This was something she'd been doing for a while. The man in bed with Linda jumped up, started grabbing his clothes, and actually tried to run past Tom to get out of the house. But Tom blocked the doorway and demanded to know who he was and how long this had been going on. The man, clearly panicked, said his name was David and that he and Linda had been seeing each other for about 8 months. And then he literally pushed past Tom and ran out of the house, leaving Linda to face Tom alone. Linda started crying immediately, begging Tom to let her explain, saying it was a mistake and it didn't mean anything, and she still loved him. All the typical things people say when they get caught cheating, but Tom was too angry to listen, too hurt to engage, so he just told her he was leaving and she needed to figure out where she was going to stay because he wanted her out of the house. Tom went to a hotel for a few days to clear his head and figure out what to do next, and during that time he decided to do some investigating because something about the situation felt off, like there was more to the story than just a simple affair. He hired a private investigator, which I know sounds extreme, but Tom said he had this nagging feeling that if Linda had been lying about this, she might be lying about other things too. The private investigator did a background check on David, the man Linda had been sleeping with, and what they found was shocking, because David wasn't just some random guy Linda had met at a coffee shop or online. He was actually someone Linda had known for years, and not only that, but Linda had been involved with multiple men over the course of their marriage, not just David. The private investigator found evidence that Linda had been using dating apps under a fake name, had been meeting men at hotels during the day while the kids were at school, and had been living this entire secret life that Tom had no idea about. Even more disturbing, the investigator discovered that Linda had been spending huge amounts of money on her affairs. Money that she'd been taking from their joint savings account and hiding by creating fake receipts for household expenses and children's activities that didn't actually exist. Tom was absolutely devastated, not just by the cheating, but by the scope and the calculation of Linda's deception, because this wasn't just someone who'd made a mistake or had a moment of weakness. This was someone who'd been systematically lying and manipulating him for years. He immediately filed for divorce, fought for primary custody of the kids, and made sure his lawyer had all the evidence the private investigator had gathered. During the divorce proceedings, even more disturbing information came out, because Linda's lawyer tried to argue that she deserved spousal support and half of everything because she'd given up her career to raise their children. But Tom's lawyer presented evidence that Linda had actually been using her time as a stay-at-home mom as a cover for her affairs, and that she'd been neglecting the children's care, leaving them with babysitters and in front of screens for hours while she went out to meet men. The court didn't look favourably on this, especially when Tom's lawyer presented testimony from neighbours and the children's teachers about concerns they'd had about the kids' well-being and Linda's inconsistent presence in their lives. Tom ended up getting primary custody of the kids, the house, and most of their assets, while Linda was ordered to pay child support and got only supervised visitation until she could prove she was capable of being a responsible parent. Tom's kids were obviously affected by the divorce, confused, and heard about why their mum wasn't around as much anymore, and Tom had to put them in therapy to help them process everything that had happened. In his Reddit posts, Tom talked about how hard it was to explain to his children that sometimes adults make bad choices, that their mum still loved them, even if she'd made mistakes, and that none of what happened was their fault. He also talked about how betrayed he felt, not just by the infidelity, but by the years of lies, the stolen money, the complete disregard for their family, and how he struggled with trusting people again, after discovering that someone he'd loved and trusted completely had been deceiving him so thoroughly. The Reddit community was overwhelmingly supportive of Tom, with many people sharing their own experiences with infidelity and offering advice on co-parenting and healing. And Tom said that having that community support really helped him feel less alone during the darkest period of his life. Tom's final update came about 2 years after his initial post, and he said he was doing much better. The kids were thriving. He'd started dating again and had met someone who seemed genuine and kind, and he'd rebuilt his life into something he was proud of. He also mentioned that Linda had continued her pattern of behaviour, that she'd moved in with one of the men she'd been having an affair with. That relationship had fallen apart, and she was now on her third or fourth relationship since the divorce, which confirmed for Tom that her issues were deep-rooted and not just about their marriage. Now let me share a story that's completely different in tone, because this one is actually kind of uplifting, despite starting in a really dark place. This story is from a woman we'll call Amanda, and it's about how she went from being homeless and addicted to drugs to completely turning her life around in a way that most people would think is impossible. Amanda posted her story on Reddit because she wanted to give hope to other people who were struggling, and she wanted to show that no matter how far down you've fallen, it's possible to climb back up if you're willing to do the work. Amanda grew up in a middle-class family with parents who loved her, did well in school, had plans to go to college and become a veterinarian because she loved animals, and everything seemed like it was going according to plan until she was 19 and got into a car accident that left her with chronic pain. Her doctor prescribed her opioid pain medication, which was supposed to be temporary, but Amanda found that the pills didn't just help with her physical pain, they also helped with her anxiety and her stress, and before she knew it, she was dependent on them. When her prescription ran out and her doctor wouldn't renew it, Amanda started buying pills illegally, spending all her money on them. And when pills became too expensive, she switched to heroin because it was cheaper and more accessible. Her parents tried to help her, sent her to rehab multiple times, but Amanda wasn't ready to get clean. She was still chasing that feeling of escape that drugs gave her, still believing that she could control her use and that she wasn't as bad off as other addicts. Eventually, her parents gave her an ultimatum: get clean and follow the rules of their house or leave. And Amanda, deep in her addiction and unable to follow any rules, chose to leave. She ended up homeless, sleeping in her car at first, and then on the streets when she had to sell her car to buy drugs. and she spent about 3 years living this way, doing things she's ashamed of to get money for drugs, losing contact with her family and friends, becoming a ghost of the person she used to be. Amanda said that her rock bottom came when she woke up one morning in a tent under a bridge, sick from withdrawal, covered in dirt, and realised that she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a real meal or taken a shower. And in that moment something clicked in her brain, a clarity she hadn't felt in years, and she thought, I don't want to die like this. She walked to a public library, used their computer to find a detox centre that had open beds, and checked herself in that same day. And she said that decision to walk into that detox centre was the hardest and bravest thing she'd ever done, because part of her brain was screaming at her to turn around and go get high instead. Detox was hell, Amanda said. It was the most physically and emotionally painful experience of her life. Her body was in agony. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, felt like she was dying. But she stuck with it because she'd made a promise to herself that she was done, that she was going to fight for her life. After detox, she went to a long-term residential treatment program, 90 days where she couldn't leave, couldn't have contact with anyone from her old life, had to participate in group therapy and individual therapy and 12-step meetings. And during that time, she started to understand the underlying issues that had led to her addiction, the trauma and the pain and the fear that she'd been trying to numb with drugs. When Amanda completed the residential program, she moved into a sober living house, a place where she lived with other women in recovery and had structure and support and accountability. And she got a job working at a coffee shop, minimum wage, nothing glamorous, but it was honest work and it made her feel like a human being again. She started rebuilding her relationship with her parents, which was slow and difficult because they'd been hurt so many times before and was scared to trust that this time would be different. But Amanda showed up consistently, called when she said she would, visited regularly, and slowly they started to believe that their daughter was really back. Amanda stayed sober for a year, then 2 years, then 5 years, and during that time she worked her way up from barista to assistant manager to eventually managing her own coffee shop. She also went back to school, taking online classes at first, and then transferring to a local community college, and eventually she got her associate's degree in business management. But what Amanda really wanted to do was help other people who were struggling with addiction, because she knew firsthand how hard it was and how much difference the right support could make. So she started volunteering at the same detox centre where she'd gotten clean, and eventually she got hired there as a peer support specialist, someone who'd been through addiction and recovery and could use that experience to help others. Amanda said that working with people in early recovery was the most meaningful thing she'd ever done. That being able to tell someone, I've been where you are and I made it out and you can too, gave her a sense of purpose she'd never felt before. She also started speaking publicly about her experience, going to schools and community centres to talk about the realities of addiction and recovery, trying to break down the stigma and shame that keeps people from asking for help. In her Reddit post, Amanda included a photo of herself from when she was homeless, strung out and barely alive, next to a current photo of her looking healthy and happy and proud. And the transformation was absolutely stunning, like looking at two completely different people. She talked about how recovery had given her back everything she'd lost, her family, her self-respect, her future, and how she gained things she never had before, like genuine self-love and the ability to face difficult emotions without running away. The response to Amanda's post was overwhelming, with thousands of people thanking her for sharing her story, people in recovery saying they were inspired to keep going, people with loved ones struggling with addiction asking for advice, and Amanda took the time to respond to as many comments as she could, offering encouragement and resources and hope. Amanda's story shows that even when things seem hopeless, even when you've lost everything and it feels like there's no way back, change is possible if you're willing to do the incredibly hard work of healing and growing. And that's a message that I think resonates with a lot of people who are struggling with their own challenges. Now let's talk about a story that involves a family secret, so bizarre and unexpected that it sounds like it should be fiction, but apparently really happened. This story comes from a man we'll call Eric, and it's about how he discovered that his grandmother had been living under a fake identity for over 50 years and wasn't actually who she claimed to be. Eric was really close with his grandmother. She'd been a huge part of his life. Growing up, babysat him when his parents worked, taught him how to bake and garden, told him stories about her childhood in a small town in Iowa, and he thought he knew everything about her. His grandmother was in her mid-80s and had been showing signs of dementia, forgetting things, getting confused, and Eric's family had moved her into a memory care facility where she could get the support she needed. One day, Eric got a call from the facility saying that his grandmother had been agitated and confused, talking about how she needed to call someone named Margaret to warn her about something. And the staff didn't know who Margaret was, because that wasn't his grandmother's name, and she'd never mentioned anyone by that name before. Eric went to visit his grandmother, and when he asked her about Margaret, his grandmother got this strange look on her face, almost like fear, and she said, "I'm Margaret. I've always been Margaret, but nobody can know." And then she seemed to snap back to her normal, confused state and didn't remember saying it. Eric was puzzled by this, thought maybe it was just the dementia causing her to mix things up, but something about the way she'd said it made him curious, so he decided to do some digging. He started going through old family documents, looking at his grandmother's birth certificate, marriage certificate, old photos, and he noticed something odd. The signature on her birth certificate didn't match the signature on her marriage certificate or any other document from her adult life, like it was written by a completely different person. Eric decided to do a more thorough investigation, and he found out that the social security number his grandmother had been using for over 50 years was issued when she was in her 30s, which didn't make sense because social security numbers are usually issued when you're born, or at least when you're young. He also found out that there was no record of anyone with his grandmother's name and birth date in the town she claimed to be from, no birth certificate, no school records, nothing, like she hadn't existed before the age of 30. Eric was completely confused and a little scared, because what he was discovering suggested that his grandmother had assumed a identity at some point in her life, and he had no idea why or what she might be hiding. He tried to talk to his parents about it, but they dismissed his concerns, said he was reading too much into things, and that old records were sometimes inaccurate or incomplete. But Eric couldn't let it go. He hired a genealogist to help him trace his grandmother's history, and what they discovered was absolutely wild, because it turned out that his grandmother had indeed been living under a false identity, and her real name was Margaret Harrison, and she'd been a completely different person before she became the grandmother Eric knew. Through old newspaper archives and public records, Eric and the genealogist pieced together the story, and it went like this. Margaret had been born in 1935 in a small town in Oklahoma, not Iowa, and she married young at 18 to a man named Robert Harrison. Margaret and Robert had 2 children together, but Robert was abusive, violent, and controlling, and in the 1960s there weren't a lot of resources or support for women trying to leave abusive marriages. Divorce was stigmatized, and women often had no financial independence or legal rights. Margaret endured the abuse for years, trying to protect her children, but when Robert's violence escalated to the point where she feared for her life and her children's lives, she made the desperate decision to run. In 1965, Margaret took her 2 children and fled in the middle of the night, left everything behind, drove to a different state, and with the help of a sympathetic women's shelter worker, she assumed a new identity, got fake documents, changed her name, and essentially disappeared. She moved to Iowa, got a job as a seamstress, raised her children under her new identity, and eventually met Eric's grandfather and got married again, starting a completely new life where nobody knew about her past. Eric was stunned by this revelation because it meant that his grandmother wasn't just hiding a small secret, she'd literally become a different person and maintained that fiction for over half a century. And it also meant that his mother and uncle, who he thought he knew everything about, had lived the first part of their lives as different people with different names. When Eric confronted his mother with this information, she broke down crying and admitted that she'd known the truth her whole life, but had been sworn to secrecy because her mother had been terrified that if her first husband ever found her, he would kill her and take the children. His mother explained that they'd lived in fear for years, always looking over their shoulders, never staying in one place too long at first, and that the decision to create new identities had been about survival, not deception. Eric asked what had happened to Robert, his grandmother's first husband, and his mother said that as far as she knew he was probably dead by now given his age, but they never checked because they didn't want to risk him somehow finding out they were looking for information about him. Eric was faced with this incredibly complex situation where he understood why his grandmother had done what she did. He sympathized with her desperate circumstances and her need to protect herself and her children. But he also felt like his entire understanding of his family history had been a lie. He also discovered that he had half-siblings he'd never known about, because Robert had remarried after Margaret disappeared and had more children, and these half-siblings had grown up thinking their father's first wife had abandoned him and their half-siblings, having no idea about the abuse or the real reason Margaret had fled. Eric decided to reach out to these half-siblings through social media, carefully explaining the situation and sharing what he'd learned. And their reactions were mixed. Some were angry and didn't believe him, thinking he was trying to slander their father's memory, but others had their own memories of their father's violence and temper and were willing to believe that the story could be true. Through DNA testing and comparing family documents, Eric was able to prove the connection, and slowly some of his newly discovered half-siblings began to accept the truth about their father and develop relationships with Eric and his side of the family. As for his grandmother, her dementia had progressed to the point where she didn't really understand what was happening. But in her moments of clarity, Eric would sit with her and tell her that he knew the truth and that he didn't judge her, that he understood she'd done what she had to do to survive, and he thought those conversations brought her some peace, like she could finally let go of a secret she'd been carrying for so long. Eric's story sparked a huge conversation on Reddit about domestic violence, the lengths women have to go to escape abuse, the failures of the legal system to protect victims, and how much things have changed and how much still needs to change. Many people shared their own stories of family members who'd disappeared or changed identities to escape dangerous situations. And there was this recognition that sometimes people do extraordinary and technically illegal things, not because they're bad people, but because they're desperate and the system has failed them. Eric's final update was about how he'd become an advocate for domestic violence, awareness and reform, using his grandmother's story as an example of why we need better protections and resources for victims, and how he'd help some of his newly discovered half-siblings process their own trauma related to their father's abuse. Now let me tell you about a workplace story that escalated in the most insane way possible and resulted in multiple people losing their jobs and one person actually going to jail. This story is from a woman we'll call Jennifer, and she posted on Reddit about her absolutely toxic co-worker who made everyone's life miserable and seemed to get away with everything until she finally went too far. Jennifer worked at a mid-sized marketing firm, and there was this co-worker, let's call her Brenda, who was notorious for being difficult. She'd steal people's ideas and present them as her own. She'd throw colleagues under the bus to make herself look better. She'd gossip and spread rumours. She'd take credit for group projects, and she had this amazing ability to charm upper management so that whenever anyone complained about her, she'd somehow spin the situation to make herself look like the victim. Jennifer had been dealing with Brenda's behaviour for about 2 years, and it was driving her crazy. But every time she tried to address it through proper HR channels, nothing would happen. Brenda would get a talking to, and then continue her behaviour, and Jennifer would be left feeling frustrated and unsupported. Things escalated when Jennifer was working on a huge campaign for a major client, something she'd been developing for months, and she'd been keeping all her work on the company's shared drive in a folder that was supposed to be password protected. Jennifer had a big presentation scheduled with the client for Friday, and she'd spent weeks preparing, creating mock-ups and strategy documents and a detailed pitch, and she was feeling really confident about it. Then, on Thursday night, Jennifer got an email from her boss saying that the presentation had been moved up was completely false. Jennifer had never said anything like that. Jennifer immediately called her boss to explain that there had been a mistake, that she was absolutely ready to present and had no idea why Brenda would be taking over. But her boss seemed confused and irritated and told Jennifer that Brenda had come to him with concerns about the project and had offered to step in, and he'd agreed because he wanted to make sure the client was impressed. Jennifer rushed into the office early Friday morning, and when she got there, she found out that Brenda had already done the presentation using Jennifer's exact work, like word for word, slide for slide, everything Jennifer had created, and the client had loved it, and Brenda was being praised as this brilliant strategist who'd saved the account. Jennifer was absolutely livid, and she marched into her boss's office with printed copies of all her original files, with timestamps showing that she created everything weeks before the presentation, and she demanded that he acknowledge what Brenda had done. Her boss looked uncomfortable and said that while it was unfortunate that there had been some miscommunication, the presentation had gone well and they'd secured the client, so maybe it was best to just move forward and not create drama. Jennifer realized in that moment that her company didn't care about ethics or fairness. They only cared about results and avoiding conflict, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. She went back to her desk and started documenting everything, every instance of Brenda stealing work, every email that proved Jennifer's ownership of projects, every conversation where Brenda had lied or manipulated situations, and she compiled it all into a detailed report. But Jennifer didn't just send this report to HR. She knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, she sent it directly to the CEO of the company, along with the client, whose account she'd been working on, and she explained exactly what had happened and how the work they'd been so impressed by had actually been stolen from her. The CEO was apparently furious, not just about the theft, but about the fact that this had been allowed to happen under management's watch, and he immediately launched an investigation. During the investigation, they discovered that Brenda had actually been doing this for years, not just with Jennifer but with multiple employees, and she'd built her entire career at the company on stolen work and manipulation. Even worse, they discovered that Brenda had been accessing other people's files on the shared drive by somehow getting their passwords, and the IT department found evidence that she'd installed key logging software on several computers to steal passwords, which was not only a violation of company policy, but actually illegal. Brenda was immediately fired, and the company pressed charges against her for unauthorized computer access and theft of proprietary information. And because some of the stolen work involved client information that was confidential, it was considered a serious crime. Jennifer's boss was also fired for failing to address the situation properly and for showing favoritism to Brenda, and the entire management structure of their department was reshuffled. The client that Brenda had presented to was informed about what had happened, and they insisted on working directly with Jennifer going forward, and they actually increased their contract with the company because they were impressed by how seriously the company had taken the situation once the CEO was informed. Brenda ended up pleading guilty to some of the charges and got probation plus community service, and she was also ordered to pay restitution to the company for the damage she'd caused. Jennifer became somewhat of a legend at her company after this, and she was promoted and given a significant raise, but more importantly, the company implemented new policies about intellectual property protection and created better systems for employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Jennifer's Reddit post went viral because it was such a satisfying example of justice being served, and people loved that she'd stood up for herself and that there had actually been consequences for the toxic co-worker, which doesn't always happen in real life. Now let me share a story about inheritance drama, because apparently nothing brings out the worst in people quite like money and death. This story comes from a guy we'll call Nathan, and it's about how his family completely imploded after his father died, and they discovered what was in his will. Nathan's father had been a successful businessman who'd built a company from nothing and sold it for a substantial amount of money, somewhere in the range of $20 million, and Nathan knew his father was wealthy but didn't know the exact amount, and had never really thought much about inheritance because his father was relatively young and healthy. Nathan had two siblings, an older brother named Kevin and a younger sister named Rachel, and they'd all had complicated relationships with their father, who was demanding and critical and had very specific ideas about how his children should live their lives. Kevin had followed in their father's footsteps and gone into business, always trying to win their father's approval, working at the family company before it was sold and positioning himself as the heir apparent. Rachel had gone the opposite direction, became an artist, lived a bohemian lifestyle that their father disapproved of, and they'd been estranged for the last 5 years of his life after a big fight about her life choices. Nathan had taken a middle path, became a teacher, had a modest but happy life, and maintained a cordial but distant relationship with his father. When their father died suddenly of a heart attack at 62, the siblings came together for the funeral, and there was already tension because Kevin felt like he should be in charge of everything since he'd been closest to their father. And Rachel was emotional and angry about the years of estrangement and the fact that she'd never get to repair their relationship. The day after the funeral, they all met with their father's lawyer to hear the reading of the will, and what they heard shocked everyone. Their father had left the bulk of his estate, about $15 million, to charity, specifically to organisations that supported education and opportunities for underprivileged children. He left Kevin $1 million, with a note that said Kevin had already benefited enormously from his business training and connections and didn't need more. He'd left Rachel $2 million, with a note saying he hoped she'd use it to pursue her art without financial stress, and that he was sorry for not understanding her path sooner. And he'd left Nathan $5 million, with a note explaining that Nathan had chosen a life of service by becoming a teacher, had never asked for anything, had lived modestly and with integrity, and deserved to be rewarded for choosing purpose over profit. Kevin absolutely lost it, started screaming that the will must be invalid, that their father couldn't have been in his right mind when he wrote it, that he dedicated his entire life to the family business and deserved more than Nathan, who'd her father for years. Rachel was crying, a mix of emotions about the money and the apology in her father's note, and Nathan was in complete shock because he'd never expected anything close to $5 million and didn't know how to process it. Kevin immediately hired a lawyer to contest the will, claiming that their father had been unduly influenced by someone, possibly Nathan, and that the distribution was unfair and didn't reflect their father's true wishes. The legal battle went on for over a year, and during that time, Kevin became absolutely vicious, started spreading rumours that Nathan had manipulated their dying father, accused Rachel of not deserving anything because she'd abandoned the family, and made it clear that he believed the entire estate should have gone to him. The court eventually ruled that the will was valid, that their father had been of sound mind when he wrote it, and that he had every right to distribute his assets however he chose, and Kevin's case was dismissed. But the damage to the family was done. Kevin refused to speak to Nathan or Rachel, blocked them on all forms of communication, and told extended family members that he'd been betrayed and robbed. Nathan struggled with guilt about receiving more than his siblings, even though logically he knew it was his father's decision, and his father had explained his reasoning. He ended up using a significant portion of his inheritance to set up a foundation in his father's name that provided scholarships for students who wanted to become teachers. And he kept working as a teacher himself because he loved his job and didn't want to change his life dramatically. Rachel used her inheritance to open an art gallery that showcased work from emerging artists who couldn't afford traditional gallery fees, and she said that her father's apology note meant more to her than the money, that having that acknowledgement that he'd been wrong to judge her choices gave her a sense of closure she desperately needed. The Reddit community had mixed reactions to Nathan's story. Some people thought the father's distribution was unfair to Kevin regardless of his reasoning. Others thought Kevin's reaction proved exactly why he didn't deserve more money. And there was a long debate about whether parents have an obligation to split estates equally among children, or whether they can use inheritance as a way to communicate their values and reward certain behaviours. Nathan's final update was about how he'd made peace with the situation, had accepted that his relationship with Kevin was probably permanently damaged, had grown closer to Rachel through the shared experience, and had found meaning in using his inheritance to honour his father's apparent belief in the value of education and service. Now I want to tell you about a story that starts as a simple tale of buying a house, but turns into something much stranger and more disturbing. This story is from a couple we'll call Mike and Sarah, and they posted on Reddit about the creepy discoveries they made after moving into their dream home. Mike and Sarah had been house hunting for over a year, looking for something affordable in a good neighbourhood where they could start a family, and they finally found a beautiful Victorian house that was being sold for well below market value. The house had been empty for about 3 years. The previous owner had died, and the estate was being handled by a distant relative who just wanted to sell it quickly, and Mike and Sarah jumped at the opportunity. The house needed some cosmetic updates, but was structurally sound, and Mike and Sarah were excited to make it their own. They moved in and started renovations, painting walls, examining the wall more closely, and he found seams that suggested there was a hidden door, like the wall was actually a panel that could open. Mike called Sarah down to look, and they decided to try to open it, and after some effort they managed to slide the panel to the side, revealing a small hidden room that was maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. The room was dark and dusty, and when they turned on a flashlight they saw that it was filled with stuff, boxes and boxes of things, and the walls were covered in photographs. Mike and Sarah started looking through everything, and what they found was deeply disturbing, because the photographs on the walls were all of women, hundreds of photographs, and they appeared to be surveillance photos, like they'd been taken without the subjects knowing. Women walking down the street, women at coffee shops, women in parking lots, and each photograph had a date written on it. The boxes contained notebooks filled with detailed notes about these women, their routines, where they lived, where they worked, who they spent time with, and it became clear that whoever had created this room had been stalking multiple women over a period of years. Mike and Sarah immediately called the police, and when the police arrived and saw the room, they treated it as a crime scene and launched an investigation. They were able to identify some of the women in the photographs and started contacting them to let them know what had been found, and several of the women came forward with stories about having had a stalker years ago, feeling like they were being watched, finding evidence that someone had been in their homes, but they had never been able to prove anything or catch the person doing it. The police investigation revealed that the previous owner of the house, an elderly man who'd seemed completely normal and harmless to his neighbours, had been the stalker, and he'd been engaging in this behaviour for decades without anyone knowing. Some of the surveillance photos dated back to the 1970s, which meant this man had been stalking women for over 40 years. The police also found evidence in the hidden room that the man had broken into some of these women's homes, stolen personal items like underwear and photographs, and kept them as trophies. Even more disturbing, there were some notebooks that contained fantasies about hurting these women, detailed descriptions of violence that the man had apparently never acted on, but had written about extensively. The police couldn't pursue any charges because the man was dead, but they were able to notify all the women they could identify and offer them closure, letting them know that the person who terrorized them was gone and couldn't hurt them anymore. Mike and Sarah were traumatized by this discovery. They'd been so excited about their dream home, and now it felt tainted and creepy, and Sarah said she couldn't sleep at night knowing what had happened in their house. They seriously considered selling the house and moving, but they'd already put so much money into it, and the market had shifted, so they would have taken a significant loss. They decided to stay, but completely renovated the basement, sealed up the hidden room permanently, had the house blessed by a priest, even though they weren't particularly religious, and tried to create new positive memories to replace the negative energy. The Reddit community was divided on whether they should have stayed in the house. Some people said they couldn't imagine living somewhere with that kind of history. Others said that the house itself wasn't evil, and that they shouldn't let the previous owner's actions drive them out of their home. Mike and Sarah also faced some backlash from neighbours who upset that the story had gone public because it made the neighbourhood look bad, and they worried about property values, which Sarah said was the most disturbing part of the whole aftermath, that people cared more about money than about the women who'd been victimised. Several of the women who'd been stalked reached out to Mike and Sarah to thank them for reporting what they'd found, and some of them said that knowing their stalker was dead and couldn't hurt anyone else gave them a sense of peace they'd been seeking for years. Mike and Sarah's final update was that they decided to start a true crime podcast where they researched and told stories about cases like this, cases where justice was delayed or where victims never got resolution, and they wanted to use their platform to raise awareness about stalking and the importance of taking these crimes seriously. Now let me tell you a story about a teacher who discovered something about her student that changed both of their lives forever. This story is from a woman we'll call Mrs. Peterson, and she posted on Reddit about a situation she encountered that tested every professional boundary and moral conviction she had. Mrs. Peterson was a high school English teacher who'd been teaching for about 15 years, and she prided herself on connecting with her students and creating a classroom environment where they felt safe to express themselves. There was one student in particular, a 16-year-old girl we'll call Emma, who was incredibly bright but had become withdrawn, and her grades had dropped dramatically over the course of the school year. Mrs. Peterson had tried reaching out to Emma multiple times, asking if everything was okay, offering to help her catch up on work, but Emma always insisted she was fine and just stressed about normal teenager stuff. Then one day, Emma submitted a creative writing assignment that was supposed to be a personal narrative, and what she wrote made Mrs. Peterson's blood run cold because it was a detailed description of ongoing sexual abuse by a family member. The writing was raw and painful and clearly based on real experiences, not fiction. Mrs. Peterson knew she was a mandatory reporter, which meant she was legally required to report any suspicion of child abuse to authorities, but she also knew that reporting it could have serious consequences for Emma, could blow up her family, could put Emma in foster care, and she wasn't sure if Emma had written about it because she wanted help, or if it was just a way of processing trauma that she wasn't ready to address publicly. Mrs. Peterson decided to talk to Emma first, called her aside after class, and gently asked if the story she'd written was based on real events. Emma immediately shut down, said it was just fiction, insisted that nothing was wrong, and begged Mrs. Peterson not to make it into a big deal. But Mrs. Peterson could see the fear and desperation in Emma's eyes, and she knew that Emma needed help, even if she couldn't ask for it directly. Mrs. Peterson reported the abuse to Child Protective Services, as she was required to do, and an investigation was launched. Emma was pulled out of class by social workers, questioned extensively, and eventually removed from her home and placed with a foster family while the investigation continued. Emma was furious with Mrs. Peterson, felt betrayed and violated, sent her angry messages saying that Mrs. Peterson had ruined her life, that she'd been handling the situation in her own way and didn't need Mrs. Peterson's intervention. Mrs. Peterson was devastated, questioning whether she'd done the right thing, losing sleep over whether she'd helped Emma made everything worse. The investigation revealed that Emma had indeed been being abused by her stepfather for over 2 years, and her mother had either been unaware or had been in denial about what was happening. The stepfather was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, and Emma's mother was investigated for potential neglect and failure to protect. Emma spent the next several months in foster care, bouncing between 2 different homes, struggling with the trauma of the abuse and the additional trauma of having her entire life uprooted. And she continued to blame Mrs. Peterson for all of it, refused to speak to her, and transferred to a different English class to avoid seeing her. Mrs. Peterson struggled with tremendous guilt, wondering if she should have handled things differently, if there was a way she could have helped Emma without destroying her family structure, and she went to therapy herself to process the situation because it was affecting her ability to teach and her mental health. The stepfather's trial took about a year, and during that time Emma had to testify about what had happened to her, which was re-traumatizing and horrible, but ultimately he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Emma's mother divorced the stepfather and went through her own therapy to understand how she'd failed to protect her daughter, and eventually Emma was able to move back in with her mother once Child Protective Services determined that the home was safe. 2 years after the initial report, Mrs. Peterson received an email from Emma, who was now 18 and preparing to graduate from high school. And in the email, Emma apologized for how she'd treated Mrs. Peterson and thanked her for having the courage to do what Emma couldn't do for herself. Emma explained that at the time she had been so deep in the trauma and the manipulation of her abuser that she couldn't see a way out, and she'd been angry at Mrs. Peterson for forcing her to confront what was happening when she'd been trying to survive by pretending it wasn't that bad. But now, with distance and therapy and time, Emma could see that Mrs. Peterson had saved her life, that if the abuse had continued, she doesn't know if she would have survived emotionally or possibly even physically. Emma wrote that she was going to college in the fall to study social work because she wanted to help other kids who were going through what she went through, and that Mrs. Peterson's willingness to do the hard thing even when it wasn't appreciated had inspired her to be brave in her own life. Mrs. Peterson cried when she read that email, and she shared it on Reddit because she wanted other teachers and mandatory reporters to know that sometimes you have to do something that feels terrible in the moment because it's the right thing in the long run, and that you might never get thanked for it, but you still have to do it. The Reddit community overwhelmingly supported Mrs. Peterson's decision, with many people sharing their own stories of abuse and wishing they'd had a teacher or adult who'd been brave enough to intervene. Some commenters who worked in Child Protective Services explained that while the system isn't perfect and being removed from home is traumatic, it's often necessary to stop ongoing abuse, and that kids in Emma's situation almost always blame the reporter initially because it's safer to be angry at the teacher than at the family member who's abusing them. Mrs. Peterson's story sparked a broader conversation about the challenges of being a mandatory reporter, the moral weight of those decisions, and the importance of trusting your instincts when you suspect a child is being harmed, even if they deny it. Now let me tell you about a story that involves a wedding and a family secret that came out in the most dramatic way possible. This story is from a woman we'll call Lisa, and it's about how her brother's wedding turned into an absolute disaster when a secret affair was exposed in front of 200 guests. Lisa's brother, we'll call him Jake, was getting married to his longtime girlfriend Amy, and they'd been planning this wedding for over a year. Huge elaborate affair at a fancy venue with all their friends and family invited. Lisa was the maid of honour, and she'd been helping with all the planning, throwing the bachelorette party, giving speeches at the rehearsal dinner, doing everything a good sister would do. The wedding day arrived, and everything seemed perfect. Beautiful weather, gorgeous decorations. Amy looked stunning in her dress, and everyone was happy and excited. The ceremony went smoothly. Jake and Amy exchanged vows. Everyone cried happy tears, and they moved into the reception where dinner was served and people started giving toasts. Lisa gave her maid of honour speech. It was sweet and funny, and everyone loved it. And then it was time for the best man to give his speech, Jake's best friend from college, a guy we'll call Tyler. Tyler stood up with his champagne glass, and he started his speech normally enough, talking about how he'd known Jake for 10 years, how he'd watched Jake fall in love with Amy, how happy he was for them. And then he paused, took a long drink of champagne, and said something that made everyone in the room freeze. Tyler said that he needed to confess something, that he couldn't stand up there and celebrate this marriage while keeping a secret that would destroy it, and that he'd been having an affair with Amy for the past 6 months. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop, and Amy's face went white as a sheet, while Jake just stood there looking confused, like he couldn't process what he'd just heard. Tyler continued, said that he and Amy had been sleeping together regularly, that she'd been planning to call off the wedding but hadn't been able to go through with it because of all the money that had been spent and the pressure from both families, and that he was sorry, but he couldn't let Jake marry someone who was cheating on him without knowing the truth. All hell broke loose. Jake lunged at Tyler and they started fighting, punching each other while guests screamed and tried to pull them apart. Amy was sobbing and trying to explain. Lisa was in complete shock, trying to figure out what to do, and parents from both sides were yelling at each other. Security had to come and break up the fight. Tyler left with a black eye and bloody nose. Jake was beside himself with rage and heartbreak, and Amy was hysterical, alternating between apologizing and blaming Tyler for manipulating her and saying it didn't mean anything. The reception obviously ended immediately. Guests awkwardly collected their things and left. The venue staff stood around not knowing what to do, and Lisa found herself trying to comfort Jake while also dealing with the logistics of a wedding that had imploded. In the aftermath, Jake obviously didn't go on the honeymoon. The marriage was annulled, since they had only been married exposing the affair. Some people argued that Tyler was a terrible friend for sleeping with Jake's fiancée in the first place, and that his confession at the wedding was more about salving his own guilt than protecting Jake. Others argued that as awful as the timing was, at least Tyler had prevented Jake from legally marrying someone who was cheating on him, and that finding out 6 months into a marriage would have been even worse. There were also questions about whether Tyler and Amy's affair had been ongoing before the engagement, or if it had started during the wedding planning, and whether Amy had ever actually loved Jake, or if she'd been with him for security and stability while being attracted to Tyler. Lisa later updated her post with more information, explaining that after the initial shock wore off, Jake had done some investigating and discovered that Amy and Tyler had actually been involved for over a year, not just 6 months, and that Tyler had been lying about the timeline to make it seem less bad. Jake also found evidence that Amy had been planning to continue the affair after the wedding, that she'd told Tyler she was going to stay married to Jake for financial reasons, but keep Tyler as her lover, and that Tyler had only confessed because he wanted Amy to leave Jake and be with him exclusively, and when she refused, he blew up her wedding out of spite. This additional information made everyone as involved look even worse, and Jake realised he'd dodged a massive bullet, because if Tyler hadn't confessed, he would have been trapped in a marriage with someone who was actively planning to betray him indefinitely. Jake went through a really dark period after this, felt like he couldn't trust anyone, questioned every relationship he'd ever had, and struggled with depression and anger. His family rallied around him. Lisa took time off work to stay with him for a few weeks. His parents helped him sort out the financial mess of the cancelled wedding and the annulment, and slowly he started to heal. About a year after the wedding disaster, Jake posted his own update on Reddit, and he said that while the experience had been traumatic, it had ultimately been a blessing because it showed him who people really were and taught him to trust his instincts, because looking back, he realised there had been signs that something was off with Amy, times when she was distant or secretive, and he'd ignored those red flags because he was so focused on the wedding and the life they were supposed to build together. Jake had started dating again, was taking things slow and being more cautious, and he'd actually met someone he really liked, who was honest and straightforward and did not play games. As for Amy and Tyler, their relationship fell apart almost immediately after the wedding. Surprise, surprise. Because apparently a relationship built on betrayal and deception isn't a solid foundation, and last Jake heard they both regretted everything and wished they'd handled things differently. Lisa's final update was that the whole situation had made her family much closer, that going through something that dramatic and painful together had strengthened their bonds, and that while she wouldn't wish that experience on anyone, she was grateful for how it had ended up working out for her brother. Now I want to share a story about someone who made a seemingly small decision that ended up changing their entire life trajectory in an unexpected way. This story comes from a guy we'll call Chris, and it's about how saying yes to a random invitation led to discovering a talent he never knew he had and building a career he'd never imagined. Chris was working a boring office job that he hated, sitting in a cubicle doing data entry for an insurance company, making barely enough money to pay his bills, and feeling completely stuck and unfulfilled in his life. He'd gone to college for business because it seemed like a practical choice, graduated with decent grades but no real passion, and fell into the insurance job because he needed to pay off student loans, and it was the first offer he got. Chris had been at this job for about 3 years, and he was miserable, waking up every morning dreading going to work, spending his days watching the clock, and feeling like his life was passing him by. One day Chris was eating lunch at a park near his office, and a guy approached him and asked if he wanted to participate in a volunteer project that weekend, helping to build a community garden in a low-income neighbourhood. The guy explained that he was organising the project through a local non-profit, and they needed volunteers who could do physical labour. And Chris's first instinct was to say no because he had plans to spend the weekend on his couch watching TV and feeling sorry for himself. But something made him say yes instead. Maybe just a desire to do something different, to feel useful for once, and he wrote down the details and showed up that Saturday morning. The volunteer project was actually really fun. Chris spent the day digging and planting and building raised beds, working alongside about 20 other volunteers, and there was this energy and camaraderie that he'd never experienced at his office job. One of the other volunteers was a woman named Diana who ran a landscape design business, and she and Chris got to talking while they worked, and she mentioned that she was always looking for people to help with installations and design work. Chris told her he didn't know anything about landscaping, and Diana said that was okay, she could teach him, and that some of the best landscapers she knew had started with no experience, but had a good eye for design and a willingness to learn. Chris ended up giving Diana his number, and she called him the next week, asking if he wanted to help with a residential project she was working on. Said she'd pay him $20 an hour, which was more than he was making at the insurance company, and he agreed to help on a Saturday. That one Saturday job turned into another and another, and Chris found that he absolutely loved the work, loved being outside, loved seeing a space transform from overgrown and messy to beautiful and functional, loved working with his hands instead of staring at a computer screen all day. Diana started teaching him about different plants and design principles and hardscaping techniques, and Chris discovered he had a natural talent for visualizing how spaces could look and solving the practical problems that came up during installations. After about 6 months of working with Diana on weekends and evenings, Chris made the terrifying decision to quit his office job and work for her full time, even though it meant taking a pay cut initially and giving up the security of a steady corporate job. His family thought he was crazy, told him he was throwing away his business degree, warned him that he'd regret leaving a job with benefits and a retirement plan, but Chris felt more excited about life than he had in years, so he took the leap. Working full-time for Diana, Chris learned everything he could about landscape design and horticulture, took online courses, read books, practiced drawing designs, and within a year, Diana was trusting him to manage his own projects and meet with clients. Chris discovered that he had a gift for understanding what clients wanted, even when they couldn't articulate it clearly, for translating their vague ideas into concrete, beautiful designs that exceeded their expectations. After working for Diana for about 3 years, Chris decided to start his own landscape design business, and Diana was incredibly supportive, even helped him find his first few clients, and gave him advice on running the business side of things. Chris's business grew slowly at first, mostly through word of mouth and referrals, but within a couple of years he had more work than he could handle and had to hire employees of his own. 10 years after that random decision to volunteer at a community garden, Chris owned a successful landscape design company with 15 employees, made 3 times what he would have made if he'd stayed in insurance, and most importantly, he loved what he did every single day. He posted on Reddit about his journey because he wanted to encourage people who felt stuck in jobs they hated to be open to unexpected opportunities, to say yes to things that seemed random or outside their comfort zone, because you never know what might lead to finding your purpose. Chris's story resonated with thousands of people, and many commenters shared their own stories about making career changes later in life or discovering unexpected talents. Chris also talked about how different his life would have been if he'd said no to that volunteer invitation, if he'd stayed on his couch that Saturday, and how one small decision had completely altered his trajectory, and that awareness made him more intentional about continuing to say yes to new experiences and opportunities. Now let me tell you about a story that involves a medical mystery that took years to solve and nearly killed the person involved. This story is from a woman we'll call Patricia, and it's about her journey through the healthcare system, trying to figure out what was wrong with her, while doctors dismissed her symptoms and told her it was all in her head. Patricia started experiencing strange symptoms when she was in her late 20s, things like extreme fatigue, joint pain, brain fog, random episodes where she'd faint or nearly faint, digestive issues, and weird skin rashes that would come and go. She went to her primary care doctor, who ran some basic blood tests, found nothing obviously wrong, and told her she was probably just stressed and needed to exercise more and eat better. Patricia tried to follow this advice, but her symptoms kept getting worse, and she went back to the doctor multiple times over the next year, and each time she was told that her tests were normal and there was nothing physically wrong with her. Maybe she should see a therapist because it might be anxiety or depression manifesting as physical symptoms. Patricia did see a therapist, and while therapy was helpful for dealing with the frustration of being sick and not knowing why, it didn't make her physical symptoms any better, because surprise, they weren't psychological, they were real physiological problems that just weren't being diagnosed. Over the next several years, Patricia saw probably 15 different doctors, went to specialists, had countless tests done, spent thousands of dollars on medical bills, and kept being told that nothing was wrong, or that her symptoms were vague and non-specific and probably just part of getting older or being a busy modern woman. Patricia's quality of life deteriorated dramatically. She had to quit her job because she couldn't reliably make it through a workday without having episodes. Her social life disappeared because she never knew when she'd feel well enough to make plans, and her relationships suffered because people got tired of hearing about a mysterious illness and started to think maybe the doctors were right and it was all psychosomatic. Patricia felt like she was losing her mind, started questioning her own reality, wondering if maybe she was somehow making herself sick, and she went through a period of really dark depression where she thought about just giving up on finding answers. Then one day, Patricia was scrolling through social media and came across a post from someone describing symptoms that were almost identical to hers. And this person had been diagnosed with something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder that affects collagen throughout the body and can cause a wide range of symptoms that seem unrelated. Patricia started researching EDS and realized that she fit the diagnostic criteria perfectly. Not just the symptoms, but also physical characteristics like being extremely flexible, having skin that bruised easily, and having a history of injuries and dislocations that had seemed weird, but she'd never connected. She found a specialist who was knowledgeable about EDS, had to travel to another state to see them because there weren't many doctors who understood the condition, and after a thorough examination and genetic testing, she was finally diagnosed with classical type Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Getting the diagnosis was both a relief and a frustration. Relief because she finally had an answer and validation that she wasn't crazy. Frustration because if doctors had listened to her and done proper examinations years earlier, she could have been diagnosed sooner and maybe prevented some of the damage and complications that had developed from years of improper treatment and mismanagement of her condition. With the EDS diagnosis, Patricia was finally able to get appropriate treatment, which included physical therapy specifically designed for hypermobile patients, pain management strategies that actually worked for her type of pain, dietary changes to help with her digestive issues, and most importantly, validation and understanding from medical professionals who finally believed that her symptoms were real. Patricia also connected with the EDS community online and found thousands of other people, mostly women, who'd had similar experiences of being dismissed and gaslit by doctors for years before getting diagnosed, and this community support was incredibly healing because she realised she wasn't alone and that the problem wasn't her. It was a healthcare system that often fails to take women's pain and symptoms seriously, and that doesn't train doctors adequately about rare conditions. Patricia became an advocate for better medical education about EDS and other rare diseases, started speaking at medical conferences about the patient experience of being misdiagnosed and dismissed, and worked with patient advocacy groups to push for changes in how doctors approach patients with complex or unusual symptoms. She also started a blog where she documented her journey and provided resources for other people who suspected they might have EDS or were struggling to get diagnosed, and her blog became really popular and helped hundreds of people find the information they needed to advocate for themselves with their doctors. Patricia's story on Reddit got massive attention because so many people, especially women, related to the experience of not being believed by doctors, of having pain and symptoms dismissed as anxiety or attention seeking, and of having to fight for years to get proper medical care. There were thousands of comments from people sharing similar stories about autoimmune diseases, endometriosis, POTS, fibromyalgia, and other conditions that are often misdiagnosed or dismissed, and it conversation about medical gaslighting and the need for doctors to actually listen to patients instead of assuming they know better based on limited information. Patricia's final update was about how she'd rebuilt her life with her diagnosis, had found work she could do from home on her good days, had educated her family and friends about her condition so they understood why she had to cancel plans sometimes or needed accommodations, and most importantly, had learned to trust herself and her own experience of her body regardless of what doctors or anyone else said. Now let me tell you about a story involving a man who discovered his wife had been faking a terminal illness for years to manipulate him and others, and this is honestly one of the most disturbing examples of deception I've ever read. This story comes from a guy we'll call David, and when he posted it on Reddit, people initially didn't believe him because it seemed too outrageous to be true, but he provided so much documentation and evidence that it became clear this had really happened. David had been married to his wife, let's call her Michelle, for about 8 years when she told him she'd been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer and had a very poor prognosis, maybe 2 to 3 years, to live with aggressive treatment. David was obviously devastated, but he immediately went into supportive husband mode, went with Michelle to her doctor appointments, helped her research treatment options, started a fundraiser to help with medical expenses, and basically reorganized his entire life around supporting his dying wife. Michelle started what she said was chemotherapy, and she had all the expected side effects, lost her hair, was tired and nauseous all the time, lost a significant amount of weight, and David never questioned any of it because why would he? Why would anyone think their spouse was faking cancer? The community rallied around them. Friends organised meal trains and fundraisers. Michelle's workplace gave her paid leave and donated sick days. David's family sent money to help with bills, and Michelle became something of a local inspiration, sharing her journey on social media and talking about staying positive in the face of terminal illness. This went on for about 2 years, with Michelle supposedly going through multiple rounds of chemo, having surgeries to remove tumours, and experiencing various complications that required hospitalizations. David was exhausted from being a caregiver, while also working full-time to keep their insurance and pay bills, and he was emotionally preparing himself for the inevitable day when he'd lose his wife. Then one day, David was looking for some financial documents in Michelle's desk and found a folder with medical bills, and when he looked at them more closely he noticed something strange. The bills were from a fertility clinic, not an oncology centre, and they were dated from the time period when Michelle was supposedly getting chemotherapy. David was confused and tried to rationalise it, thought maybe the bills were old, or maybe there was some connection between fertility treatments and cancer treatments he didn't understand, but something felt off, so he started looking more carefully at other documents. He found appointment cards for a fertility specialist, pharmacy receipts for fertility drugs, and then he found the smoking gun, an email exchange between Michelle and her sister, where Michelle talked about her plans to get pregnant and how she was taking hormones and how she hoped David wouldn't find out before she could surprise him. David's brain couldn't process what he was seeing, because if Michelle was trying to get pregnant. She obviously didn't have terminal cancer, but that would mean she'd been lying for 2 years, which seemed impossible, except the evidence was right there in front of him. David confronted Michelle that evening, and at first she tried to deny it, said he was misunderstanding the documents, but when he pushed harder and said he was going to call her oncologist directly, she broke down and admitted that she'd never had cancer at all. Michelle confessed that she'd made up the diagnosis because she was feeling neglected in their marriage. David had been working long hours and wasn't paying enough attention to her, and she wanted him to prioritize her and show her that he loved her. She said it had started as a small lie, just telling David she'd had some concerning test results, and then it spiraled and she didn't know how to stop it without admitting she'd lied. So she just kept going deeper and deeper into the deception. David was absolutely horrified, not just by the lie, but by the fact that Michelle had let so many people donate money and time and emotional energy to supporting her through a fake illness, that she'd taken advantage of everyone's kindness and compassion for 2 years. He immediately kicked Michelle out of the house, filed for divorce, and reported what had happened to the police, because Michelle had essentially committed fraud by accepting donations under false pretenses. The fallout was massive. Everyone who'd supported Michelle felt betrayed and angry. The money that had been raised through fundraisers had to be returned, which was complicated because some of it had already been spent, and Michelle faced criminal charges for fraud and had to do community service and probation. David also discovered during the divorce proceedings that Michelle had been faking or exaggerating illnesses throughout their entire relationship, not just the cancer. She claimed to have various conditions and allergies and disorders that required special accommodations and attention, and David realized it had been manipulated for years. The experience absolutely shattered David's ability to trust people, and he went through intensive therapy to process the betrayal and manipulation. He posted on Reddit partly to warn other people about this kind of Munchausen adjacent behaviour, and partly just to process his own trauma by sharing it with others. The Reddit community was overwhelmingly supportive of David, with many people expressing shock and disgust at Michelle's behaviour, and several mental health professionals weighed in to explain that what Michelle had done suggested serious personality disorders and a level of manipulation that indicated she needed significant psychiatric help. Some people criticized David for not noticing sooner or not going to doctor appointments with Michelle, but others pointed out that when you trust someone and they're telling a consistent story with what appears to be physical evidence like hair loss and weight loss, it's not unreasonable to believe them, especially when doubting them would mean suspecting your spouse of something so monstrous. David's final update was that the divorce had been finalized. Michelle had been ordered to pay restitution to the people she'd defrauded, and he was slowly rebuilding his life and trying to learn how to trust again, but that he'd probably carry the emotional scars of that betrayal for the rest of his life. Now I want to tell you about a much lighter story to balance out some of the heavy content, and this one is about a guy who accidentally became a local legend because of a series of misunderstandings and coincidences. This story is from a man place where everyone knows everyone, and gossip spreads faster than wildfire. Greg was a pretty ordinary guy, worked as an accountant, kept to himself mostly, didn't have a particularly exciting life. One day, Greg was walking his dog early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m, when most people were still asleep, and he noticed smoke coming from a neighbour's garage. Greg immediately called 911 and then ran over and started banging on the door to wake up the family, and thanks to his quick action, the family got out safely before the fire spread to the main house. The local newspaper did a story about it, calling Greg a hero, and he got a little award from the fire department at a town council meeting. That same week, completely unrelated, Greg happened to be at the grocery store when an elderly woman collapsed in the parking lot, and Greg, who'd taken a CPR class years ago for a job requirement, started performing CPR while someone else called for help, and the woman survived and made a full recovery. Again, the local newspaper covered it, and suddenly Greg was being called a hero twice in 1 week. Then, and this is where it gets ridiculous, Greg was driving home from work and saw a kid's bike in the middle of the road, and he stopped to move it so no one would hit it, and it turned out the bike belonged to a kid who'd run away from home, and the family had been looking for him, and when they found the bike, they were able to track down the kid who was hiding in a nearby park. The family assumed Greg had somehow found the bike and helped locate their son, and they thanked him profusely and told everyone in town about how Greg had saved their kid. None of these things were actually that heroic. Greg was just in the right place at the right time and did what any decent person would do, but the town had decided he was some kind of superhero, and the legend started to grow. People started attributing other good things that happened in town to Greg, like someone would find a lost wallet returned with all the money still in it, and they'd assume Greg had found it and returned it, even though Greg had nothing to do with it. The town started inviting Greg to be the Grand Marshal of the 4th of July parade, asked him to judge the local baking contest, wanted him to give motivational speeches at the high school, and Greg found himself becoming this reluctant local celebrity when all he wanted was to live his quiet life. The situation reached peak absurdity when the mayor announced they were commissioning a mural in downtown that would feature local heroes, and Greg's face was going to be prominently displayed alongside historical figures who'd actually done significant things for the community. Greg posted on Reddit asking how to politely decline this honour without offending the entire town, and the responses ranged from suggesting he just embrace it and enjoy his unearned fame, to advising him to move to a different town before they erected a statue of him. Greg decided to give a speech at the mural unveiling, where he gently explained that while he appreciated the recognition, he didn't think he deserved to be called a hero for doing basic, decent human things, and he wanted to redirect the attention to actual first responders and community volunteers who did heroic work every single day. His speech was humble and kind, and instead of diminishing his reputation, it somehow made people like him even more, because now he was not only a hero, but also a modest hero who didn't seek attention. The mural still got painted with Greg's face on it, but they also added faces of firefighters and EMTs and teachers, so at least Greg wasn't alone up there. Greg's final update was that he'd learned to accept Reddit community loved Greg's story because it was so absurd and wholesome, and many people said they wish their communities celebrated kindness and decency the way Greg's town did, even if they'd gotten a little carried away with it. Now let me share one final story, and this one is about a person who discovered a family secret that explains so much about their childhood and helped them understand themselves in a completely new way. This story comes from a person we'll call Alex, and it's about discovering they were conceived through IVF using a sperm donor, information their parents had kept hidden for 30 years. Alex had always felt a little different from their siblings, not in any major way, but just small things. Different interests, different personality, different physical features. And whenever Alex would point out these differences, their parents would brush it off and say that's just how genetics works, families have variety. Alex's dad was also somewhat distant emotionally, affectionate with Alex's siblings, but oddly formal and restrained with Alex, and Alex had always assumed their dad just didn't like them as much for some unknown reason. When Alex was 30 years old, they decided to do one of those DNA ancestry tests, partly out of curiosity about ethnic background, and partly because they were interested in genealogy. When the results came back, Alex was shocked to see that they had a significant percentage of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, which didn't make any sense because both of Alex's parents were of Irish and Italian descent, with no Jewish heritage at all. Alex initially thought there must have been a mistake with the test, so they did another one with a different company and got the same results. And that's when they started to realise something was very wrong. Alex looked at the DNA relatives section of the website and saw dozens of matches to people with Jewish surnames who claimed to be second and third cousins, people Alex had never heard of, and none of Alex's known relatives showed up in the matches at all. Alex's heart started racing because they realised what this meant. One of their parents wasn't actually their biological parent, and based on the fact that their mom's side of the family wasn't showing up but their siblings' DNA would presumably match their mom, it had to be their dad who wasn't biologically related to them. Alex confronted their parents with this information, and at first they tried to deny it, said the tests must be wrong, but Alex had done enough research and had enough evidence that eventually their parents admitted the truth. They explained that they'd struggled with infertility when they were trying to have Alex, that Alex's dad had a medical condition that made his sperm non-viable, and they'd decided to use a sperm donor from a sperm bank to conceive. They said they'd never planned to tell Alex because they wanted to protect the integrity of their family and didn't want Alex to feel different or less loved. And by the time Alex was old enough to potentially understand, so much time had passed that bringing it up seemed like it would only create problems. Alex was furious, not about being donor conceived, but about the decades of lies and the fact that their dad's emotional distance suddenly made sense. He'd probably struggled to bond with a child who wasn't genetically his, and Alex had spent their whole childhood thinking there was something wrong with them that made their dad unable to love them fully. Alex started researching their biological father through the DNA matches and sperm bank records, and they discovered that their donor had been a 1990s who'd donated sperm to make extra money, and he'd apparently donated prolifically because Alex found they had over 50 half-siblings scattered across the country. Some of these half-siblings had formed a network and were in contact with each other, and when Alex reached out, they were welcomed into this community of donor-conceived people who were all trying to understand their origins and connect with genetic relatives. Alex eventually tracked down their biological father, who was now a doctor in his 60s, living across the country. And after some initial hesitation, he agreed to meet with Alex. The meeting was emotional and strange, because here was a person who was genetically Alex's father, but was essentially a stranger, and he had mixed feelings about being contacted by his donor offspring. He'd never expected to be found and wasn't sure what kind of relationship, if any, he wanted to have. Over time, Alex developed a friendly relationship with their biological father, not a traditional parent-child relationship, but more like a mentorship or distant family connection. And Alex also built relationships with several of their half-siblings who shared their experiences of discovering their donor conception and grappling with questions of identity and belonging. Alex's relationship with their dad, who raised them, became even more strained after the revelation, because Alex felt like they needed space to process the betrayal, and their dad felt attacked and defensive about choices he'd made 30 years ago that he thought were right at the time. Through therapy, Alex eventually came to understand that their dad had loved them the best he could, but had struggled with his own feelings of inadequacy and loss around his infertility, and that his emotional distance hadn't been about Alex being unlovable, but about his own unresolved pain. Alex also came to appreciate the complexity of donor conception, how it creates these unusual family structures, where people can have dozens of half-siblings they've never met, where identity becomes complicated because genetic heritage and family culture don't necessarily align, and where issues of medical history and inherited traits become mysterious. Alex's story resonated with thousands of people on Reddit, many of whom were also donor-conceived or had discovered late in life that their parentage wasn't what they'd believed, and there was this sense of shared experience and validation that helped Alex feel less alone. The donor conception community has been advocating for changes in laws and policies around sperm and egg donation, pushing for more transparency and for the rights of donor-conceived people to know their genetic origins, and Alex became involved in this advocacy work, using their story to illustrate why these issues matter. Alex's final update was that they'd reached a place of acceptance about their situation, had integrated both their raised family and their genetic family into their sense of self, and had learned that identity is complicated and can't be reduced to simply genetics or simply upbringing, but is this complex interplay of both, and that what matters most is not where you come from, but how you choose to move forward with the knowledge you have. And I think that's a really beautiful and profound way to end this collection of stories, because ultimately so many of these stories are about people discovering difficult truths and finding ways to survive and grow and build meaningful lives despite and sometimes because of those truths. And if there's one thing that connects all of these stories, it's the resilience of human beings, our ability to face devastating betrayals and shocking revelations and profound losses, and somehow find a way to keep going, to rebuild, to learn, to connect with others who understand, and to create meaning out of even the most painful experiences. And I hope that these stories have kept you engaged and made you think about your own life and your own relationships and the secrets that families keep and the ways that truth eventually surfaces and the importance of honesty and compassion and the incredible complexity of being human in this world where everyone is carrying their own burdens and fighting their own battles and trying their best to make sense of the chaos. So thank you for staying with me through all 7 hours of these incredible, heartbreaking,